I'm joined today by a longtime friend, David Reaboi. He is a fellow at the Claremont Institute, and he has a multitude of talents and different interests. And before we get started, David, why don't you just talk a little bit about what you do and how you got started doing what you're doing, and we'll go from there.
Sure, it's great to be with you. I'm very glad that we kind of finally got a chance to do this. So I've been working in politics, or let's say politics adjacent communications universe, for I guess almost 20 years now. I started off doing counterterrorism analysis because not because of some kind of academic course of study, but because I was in New York on 9/11, and I was curious about the people who attacked us, the Islamists, and what they actually believe in their own words. And I thought that what was going on at the time in media was let's say a misrepresentation of what these guys were after, and I was genuinely curious. How could people who are this kind of evil and delight in indiscriminate killing, what is their doctrinal motivation? So I started to study on my own. At the time, I was playing jazz in New York and later in San Francisco. And most of my time was spent reading Islamist texts. And helpfully enough, they're all in English. I mean, they've all been translated into English because these guys thought and still believe that it's important to be able to explain what they do. I mean, it's one of the hallmarks of Islamists is what is a fatwa? A fatwa is a legal proof. It's not a pronouncement from on high. It is like a judicial ruling about a certain thing. So it's very important for these guys to have a factual basis, or at least the way they understand the factual basis. So this is what I was involved in, and I get a job in Washington, D.C. in 2008, sort of doing this for real. And at that point, I met Andrew Breitbart, and really my life changed because he became a mentor of mine. We started up a national security website together. I worked closely with the Breitbart team, and he just taught me how to run a media shop. And how to run websites and sort of things like that, and the importance of messaging and narratives and the way you lay a story out kind of sequentially. I think today, sort of as an aside, I think the person who today best exemplifies this type of method in a successful way is my buddy Chris Rufo, who's just absolutely fantastic in terms of laying out, making very strategic, specific, let's say limited claims that only he could support, and that he can absolutely support given the fact patterns, and then sort of lay out, boom, 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 one after the other. So that's sort of the discipline that I kind of came up in my time working in politics. And sort of subsequent to that, I became affiliated first with the Claremont Institute. I guess in 2011 was when I did my Lincoln Fellowship, and I've been intimately involved with them for a while. Right now, I do numerous things for Claremont, including their series of publications. There will be more coming out. Right now, we've got a series called Provocations that's a kind of monograph series, but we're going to be doing a lot more on that. And then I started Late Republic Nonsense, which was a place for me to discuss kind of contemporary politics. And I realized several years ago that the things that I was thinking about in national security. I mean, I wrote a book about Qatar and information operations, and I spent a lot of time sort of focused on the Middle East. And I just realized that what is going on in the United States domestically is far more significant than anything that is happening on the other side of the world. And what is more is that what is happening on the other side of the world is very, very intimately tied to what's going on domestically in a way that's not appreciated, I think, to the extent that it should be. So so I've been doing that, and then lately I'm starting a kind of design firm, because the other thing that I like to do is I like to do visual artwork as well as music and writing and things like that, and it's just another kind of mode of expression for me. And frankly, it's a lot more fun to be able to create something beautiful myself and say, here, I put it out, and let people enjoy it, let me enjoy it, let me enjoy the process, as opposed to sort of doing what everyone else is doing in politics, which is like, hey, here's my article, these are my profound thoughts, these are my tweets, book me on the latest shows. So this is a kind of alternate strategy, and as ever, it's not really thought out. It's just kind of strategic improvisation, which is the name of my consulting firm.
Very interesting. So I guess touching on what you were discussing, you're launching your design firm, and with this interest you have in music, can you go back a little bit and talk about pre-politics, how you got started in music in the first place in New York City, and where that's taken you, and how that's evolved through all these years?
Yeah, my interest in politics actually goes back before music. I was a National Review subscriber when I was in 7th or 8th grade, for sure by 8th grade, but I think 7th grade. I was a subscriber of the American Spectator back when they were doing the Real Anita Hill thing with David Brock. I'm a sort of OG, right-wing political junkie whose opinions haven't changed much in essence since then. I mean, they've changed a lot, but let's say the temperament hasn't changed. And then when I was going to school, I went to GW, and I got a degree in really what it was in Cold War history, and it happened right at the end of the Cold War, kind of as it happened to work out. And the professors that I had, some of them were good, most of them were, pretty unremarkable. They were literally teaching Thomas Friedman the Lexus and the olive tree. Mm-hmm. I mean, this is sort of the level that they were operating at, which was, hey, history is over. The Cold War is over. We have nothing left in terms of human history other than let's make some money, and globalization is going to be awesome. And I looked at this, and I mean, I was in international law class, and I raised my hand and I said, does this even exist? What is the basis for international law? And, if not, at the end of the day, people agreeing to settle their differences in, according to a specific set of rules as opposed to by force. And then they didn't like me very much. And so that's what I was dealing with. It was the Clinton era. Mm-hmm. So I didn't find a lot of interest or drama there. So instead, at the same time, is when I got hooked into jazz. And I was let's say a classic rock listener in New Jersey, mm-hmm. which was a great place to grow up listening to classic rock. It was just a kind of fantastic time. Jersey was metal as all get out. And the radio stations were great. My group of friends, we were kind of very, very interested in this particular thing, the Who, Zeppelin, stuff like that. We kind of skipped the grunge thing, and we were into the Beatles. And at the time, in the early '90s, nobody cool was into the Beatles. That was just not a thing that you were into. You were into Pearl Jam, you were into Nirvana, but the Beatles, it's like, I mean, people used to kind of make fun of me at the record store when I would show up, and I remember buying a copy of Magical Mystery Tour and Hard Day's Night when they first appeared on CD in 87, 88. And the clerk, it was here in Florida and not far from where I live now. And the clerk said, "Why are you buying this old music?" Like, just completely, and a few years later, after they released the anthology, after like the kind of reevaluation of the Beatles in popular culture, that all changed. But for a long time, you listen to the Beatles, it was moldy fig shit. It was really, people weren't doing it. And so in high school, like, we all had long hair. We all wore like, sandals and jean suits and stuff like that. Yeah. I mean, it was a kind of rebellion against what was going on at the time, because we kind of always went that way. We were just doing our own thing. Totally oblivious of what was in popular culture at the time. And then at a certain point, I guess very late in high school, early in college, definitely by the first semester of freshman year, the jazz thing had taken hold. And that just, it was like, all right, just to back up, I was a big Woody Allen fan in high school. And there was a jazz element to his films. It's a very, very, very strong one.
Yeah.
And I remember getting the Manhattan soundtrack, because at the time there was like nothing available on CD that was like a Woody Allen soundtrack. But I got Manhattan, which was the Gershwin score.
Rhapsody in Blue.
Right. So I mean, I liked that, but I was already familiar with Rhapsody in Blue, blah, blah, blah. But there was one track, and now I'm forgetting which one it was, but it was like a jazz trio. It was a piano trio. And I thought that it was magic. I don't know why. I don't know. There was something about it. I was like, this is absolutely fantastic. It was lazy. And I mean, I'm sure if I listen to it now, I go, okay, not very much is going on and blah, blah, blah. But like, the vibe was so strong. It was such a beautiful thing. And as it turned out, one of my closest friends, his dad was a huge jazz fanatic from the 50s, just a little bit older. And and it was like, all of a sudden we just discovered, like, Mark's dad has the archive. And all this time, throughout like childhood and whatever, like, we were listening to Van Halen and, all this stuff. And like, the dad had in the house like every Bill Evans record. He had he just had all this amazing music. And that's how I heard Bossa Nova for the first time, and Gets Gilberto, and Brazilian music, and Elis Regina. And I mean, it was all at this guy's house, and he had a great stereo. And we would just go and it's like, all of a sudden, a dad was cool. And we just poured over these discs. We didn't even really talk to him about it, it was like sitting there. It was a gold mine. And the first thing that we did, or the first thing that I did, I'll take responsibility myself, is I approached Bill Evans the way I would approach the Beatles in terms of discographical interest. Now, you know what I'm talking about, right? So it's like, okay, when you've got a rock band or something, or Dylan or something like that, like, you're curious, you want to put together all of the albums. You want to put together the entire, because that's how you get an idea of somebody's output, is you see it in totality.
And then you look at the bootlegs, perhaps some live performances.
Right. And that makes a certain amount of sense in the rock or pop music, so singer-songwriter context. In the jazz context, it doesn't make sense. I didn't know it at the time, and I was just like, okay, so now I get all the Bill Evans records. Well, shit, there's like 400 of them.
Yep.
And very soon it became difficult for me to say, like, okay, so here's Live in Tokyo from 72, and then here's Since We Met from 73. Is this different?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and to my untrained ear, it didn't sound different. I didn't understand what I was hearing. I hated bass solos because I would hear Eddie Gomez bass solos, and I would just be like, I don't understand what's going on. It's all happening too fast. It just sounds like fluttering bumblebees. I don't get it. Later on, I would hear Charlie Hayden, and then that was a sort of life shift for me too, when I decided that, like, I heard Charlie Hayden, and immediately I knew I need to play the bass. But that was a process that took some time.
Mm-hmm.
And for me to learn that I didn't need every Bill Evans record. I mean, now I'm like, yeah, I have every Bill Evans record. But at the time, I should have said, you know what, I'm going to do a sampling and then move on to something else, because it's so huge and you don't know. At the time, it was like, what's the thing about the elephant in the dark, right? Everybody's touching a little different part of it. And you know, my friends and I, we would all be sort of touching different parts of the elephant, and we'd come back to the group and say, hey, this is what I got. This is blah, 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 blah. And then that's how we kind of learned with each other kind of very quickly. And then we went and we bought like the All Music Guide to Jazz in paperback before it was a website or whatever. We bought it in paperback. And then I had that was the Bible. I memorized that thing. And I was like, okay, well, this looks good. And sort of before you have a taste of your own, and like before you have the kind of the chutzpah to be like, this is good, this is a good record, and this is a bad record by someone, you should probably have some experience. But you know, so in order to get that experience, you have to do a lot of listening. And you're like, okay, well, if they think this is a well-regarded record, I'm going to at least give it a hearing and see what it's like. So it was a lot of money over the course of many years, and it became a total obsession. And I'm glad that I did it. Oh shit, you didn't even ask about music. You asked about playing.
I want to talk about all of it, so I'm glad you brought that up as well.
Yeah.
But we will revisit that topic as well. But you did mention though that through Charlie Hayden you got into playing the bass. So can you, in terms of timeline, then? So you kind of started with Bill Evans, which was, as you quickly discovered, was a very ambitious undertaking to go through the entire Bill Evans recording catalog. And then, so how did you land on Charlie Hayden in this process? And then, how quickly after did you decide that you don't want to play, jazz piano, you don't want to be a trumpet player,
Right.
but it's the bass that really drew you?
I took a few guitar lessons, but I never kind of saw myself as a guitarist. I never thought in terms of guitar. And it was the kind of thing, it was similar to how I got Miles, which is that I kind of had this vague idea, the most vague of ideas. And then when I saw the photo of Miles, I was like, I know, this is it. This is the guy. This is the dog.
For reference, this is Miles, your dog. This
Miles, my dog. Yeah. It's not Miles Davis. Right. And that's how it was with Charlie, because the record that I heard was Beyond the Missouri Sky with Pat Metheny. And if I would be cool and like the hipster thing to say was like, oh yeah, I heard the Ornette Coleman recordings at the time. And so at the same time that I heard Beyond the Missouri Sky, which is a beautiful record of acoustic duets with Metheny and Charlie. There was a guy on the radio. I mean, he's since passed, but his name was Vin Scelsa, and he was on Sunday nights. I think, what was his name? I'm forgetting the name of his show, but he was one of those guys that went back to the 70s, and he used to do like super interesting shows about whatever. And sometimes it would be jazz, sometimes it would be rock, it would be weird, whatever it would be. If you want to hear him talk, there is a video on YouTube that's absolutely amazing of Tom Waits doing a live thing in the studio and there's no bass player. It's just like Tom and a drummer. And Vin Scelsa is the DJ in the studio during this broadcast. And it's amazing. It's the best Tom Waits bootleg there is. But yeah, so I was listening to Vin Scelsa delivering pizza because that's what I used to do in Jersey on my time home from college. So I'm delivering pizza, and Vin Scelsa has on this guy, Rafi Zabor, who was a writer who wrote the book The Bear Comes Home. And Rafi Zabor is a big jazz guy, and he wrote a book about a bear tenor saxophone player who is like literally a bear, and he's got to kind of navigate the world of jazz as a bear. And it's actually it's a great book, but there's a whole section in the book which is the chapter that Vin Scelsa decided to read on the air, which was when the bear decides to book a recording session with Charlie Hayden. So you have Charlie and you have all these descriptions, and there's amazing. The section on Phil Schaap is amazing. It's hysterical. But it's a great book. It's totally worth getting into if you're a jazz guy. And it was sort of that, and then I started buying Charlie's records on his own. I heard his solo. Frankly, it was the solo on First Song, and I was like, I'd never heard anything as beautiful. I didn't know a bass could sound that way. I just thought it was the most like gorgeous thing that I've ever heard. I'm like, I need to be able to do that. I want to create something that sounds like that. And then I ended up taking sort of the last of my savings and buying the cheapest double bass I could find. It was in town. It was such a piece of shit. It was like really, really bad plywood. It was horrible. And the best part was the strings were not flat wound. The strings were wound by, it wasn't even upright strings. It was electric bass strings. Oh. And, with the rivets.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And here I am. I'm like trying to play this, and I'm sliding up and down, and blood is coming from my fingers. Mm-hmm. And I'm so stupid. I don't know anything. I don't know that these are electric bass strings. And I'm just like, how the hell? And it's buzzing on the fingerboard. And I'm like, how the hell is anybody getting a decent sound out of this? This is crazy. It's mental, Plus, like, my fingers were just covered with blood all the time and calluses and all this stuff. So once I figured out that, in fact, you need to use upright bass strings for an upright bass, things got a little bit easier.
Okay. Did you end up taking lessons, or were you trying to figure it out?
Yeah, I mean, a little of both. I mean, I would say that I'm a self-taught guy who took a lot of took a decent amount of kind of private lessons with people who musicians who I greatly respected. And then I went up to college, and I was sort of tooling around, and I do think that it's important to establish a love for kind of being with and creating something together with the instrument. Mm-hmm. Even if it sounds like crap, even if you're not doing what you want to be doing, blah, 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 like you're creating that bond of love between you and the instrument, which is very important, which frankly takes a hell of a long time to create if you're kind of being very disciplined about things, the way, like, an Asian parent would say to their kid, like, here, play this and play this. So the only thing on the piano that you learn how to play are like your stupid exercises. And you haven't yet learned how to improvise anything. You're just like rote mechanical stuff. So as someone who's primarily interested in improvisation and creating, music spontaneously, like I knew that that's what I wanted to do. I never had any interest whatsoever in playing classical music or doing, or let's say overly technical written music. It just wasn't an interest. Um, and and then I ended up going to New York. Well, first to San Francisco, where I did not bring my bass, and I was miserable. And I ended up hearing some music that was happening in New York City, and I realized I need to get to New York City. And whatever it is, I need to be a part of what was happening at that time in the late 90s in New York, downtown. So I got there and I moved in and I started going to the clubs and I started playing with people and I started to sort of do this thing, which is kind of beautiful. I don't know if it still exists in New York because the cost of living is so great, but there was a tradition over 100 years that like people were always coming. Musicians were always coming, young and old, but mostly young. We're just always showing up in New York every single year. And it was almost like college, or school or something where it's like, this is the class of, 97. This is the class of 98. These are the new people who arrived. And of course, the new people will gravitate towards one another because they know nobody. And the new people will run into one another at shows. So you go to see Charlie Hayden, and then like in the crowd, you're talking to somebody, and someone says, "Oh, I'm a guitarist." Like, "Oh, really? I'm a drummer." Blah blah blah. I'm a bass player. Let's get together and play. And that's literally exactly how these bands or these relationships are formed. And I was a part of that for several years, and I'm lucky because I got a chance to play with some of my biggest musical heroes and to get to know them and sort of be a part of that scene, which was amazing, which is something that, at the time, all of my contemporaries and many of my friends were either still in school, going to graduate school or whatever, or just sort of starting out in their work life. And like, I was doing odd jobs or working at law firms to make a living while I was playing jazz. So like I got a late start, but at the end of the day, if I really think about it, I would never trade that experience for anything. Because I think I was just like, I'm lucky and blessed to have been right there at sort of the last great moment of New York music.
I was curious, did you find from that period when you started playing the bass and you became more proficient, you were playing with other musicians, how did this change your appreciation for jazz and for this kind of music more broadly?
Well, at the time, I was thinking in a very kind of bass-centric way, right? So I was thinking like, can I do that? Or can I not, like, is that something totally beyond my comprehension? And that was a kind of interesting screen through which to see things. And I guess it's probably unavoidable, right? Like you're obsessed with proficiency or creating something of your own through an instrument. Of course you're going to see whatever lessons you get from whoever it's going to influence you. At the same time as when I kind of really got into Brazilian music was in New York. I mean, I had heard a bunch before, but it started to be an obsession when I was living in New York 20 years ago. And that was a totally different thing than jazz. And it's still a kind of different thing. It's like it's like a taste thing. Like sometimes you're really craving something sweet. Sometimes you're craving something savory. It's kind of like that. It's like bifurcated thing.
Yeah.
But for me, both of these things exist in waves kind of simultaneously since then.
Mm-hmm. And since you went down this rabbit hole of jazz, even not even getting into the Brazilian music, did you view your previous musical tastes, the Beatles and the classic rock, Did you see this in a different light? Like once you discovered the world of jazz and all the different possibilities that you can do in creating music?
Yeah, I mean, I grew to see. I grew to be like, let's say, a little more opinionated about these things than maybe I should have, because at least in the last couple of years, I'm sort of consciously trying to puncture this bubble.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes when you try really hard to puncture the bubble, like you may overshoot it, or you may come off as flippant or whatever. Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of opinionated about these things on one hand, but on the other hand, it's like at the end of the day, let people have their fun. One thing that I never do, for example, on Twitter is if someone says, "Oh, here's this band that I like or a song that I like," I will never shit on them,
Mm-hmm.
or I will never shit on the band. I'll say, you know what? Because people send me all the time. They're like, "Oh, have you heard blah 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 blah?" And I could hate it. I could loathe it. But I say, no, I'm glad you enjoy it. It's not for me.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end of the day, I think that's a good posture. But like in regards to the some of the older stuff, like, yeah, sure, it's simple. It's far more simple. Let's say the Beatles and the classic rock that I grew up with. It can't help to be. At the end of the day, I mean, I was seeking out something that was more, not more complicated for the sake of being complicated, because there's some awfully dull, very complicated music out there. But what I realized, I think, was that at the end of the day, I was never attracted to the blues form.
Mm-hmm.
That was never like a thing that really got me going. I know I have friends who were very into it, and I totally, like, I understand how people can love the simplicity of it in a kind of beautiful way, and I get it. One of the things that Brazilian music and frankly jazz provides is you have frankly a lot more interesting chords, and the melodies that are based on those chords, or you could say vice versa, whichever came first, are just very different. And I think there is something about listening to music listening to sung music in a language you don't understand, that is really beautiful and pure, because it's like the sound of surprise. They say jazz is the sound of surprise. I'm forgetting which critic came up with that. But like, it really is the sound of surprise, because if you don't understand the language, you don't know how long the phrases are. You don't know what's going to happen from one second to the next. It's a completely new thing. It's not like, okay, this song, I have an idea of where this phrase is going to go, and I can, even if I can't sing along immediately, within 2 listens, I can sing along and I got it. But in music where you don't understand the words, it's a completely different experience, and it's like being taken for a ride, and you don't know. And sort of that surprise is something that with music, it's always been a huge part for me, because I get bored easily.
Did you find that in jazz then, when you started listening to Bill Evans records, like Moonbeams or Waltz for Debbie, were you finding yourself eventually being kind of, maybe not bored, but looking for something more interesting? And maybe would that be what drove you to then some of maybe the more esoteric parts of jazz, like the
avant-garde,
the more avant-garde kind of?
Yeah, I mean, it was that it was I mean, I didn't know at the time. It was all like discovery, right? Like, we didn't know what we didn't know. So it was like, you go into a record.
Pre-internet, so
Yeah, right. It was pre-internet. So like in those days, how did you find a new record to buy? You showed up at the record store and you saw someone, like a cover that was cool. And at the time, the original Jazz Classics series used to have on the back of the CD, it had the track listing, in black, and then there was a little white column which had a review. And that review was priceless for someone who doesn't know, who needs an entry point. That review is totally priceless, because it, the people on it, we don't know who those people are. We don't know the names of the tunes. Blah blah blah, etc. But like that little blurb contextualizing what was happening was so important, and it's another reason why like I fell in love with Nat Hentoff and his work, because he wrote a lot of the liner notes for these things. But of course, the liner notes for a CD, you have to buy it first. But on that back cover, you would see the little blurb, and that's how we decided what we bought. Spending hours in the record store, like, okay, this looks looks good, and so for that reason, it wasn't like, okay, we're going to do hard bop now, we're going to do swing, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. It was sort of all over, mishmash all over. And I remember hearing the name Mingus and not really understanding, like, really, I mean, I knew he was a bass player, blah, 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 but like, you don't know. So I was with my buddy. We were, it was a summer. We went in my car. We were both delivering pizza, and with my best friend and I, and we were like, hey, we've got an hour and a half or 2 hours to kill. Let's go to CD City or whatever, and grab something new so that we have for the to listen to during the during our shift. And the 2 discs that I bought, totally like randomly. What did I buy? Same day. It was Mingus Tijuana Moods. Well, it was New Tijuana Moods, that particular RCA record. And then it was Charlie Hayden Liberation Music Orchestra.
Okay.
And it was like, okay, whatever. And listening in the car, I remember on the way back, we got stoned and put I had at that time a LeBaron convertible. I mean, it was the shittiest convertible that like they make, like the bottom of the barrel convertible, but it was a convertible. It was a beautiful summer day in Jersey. And I put on the Mingus, and track 2 was Isabel's Table Dance, which is a truly avant-garde piece. And man, my brain exploded. I just like, this was music that was so different than anything I'd ever heard. It was so passionate. It was full of fire. It was angry and beautiful and complicated, but also simple. It was everything. And that was another like kind of life-changing moments for me, because it was like all of a sudden you can see in color, you can see things that, your palette is expanded. I didn't even know there was music like this in the world until I heard that record. And I still listen to it. I still love it. It's I mean, it's just absolutely fantastic. And sort of from there, I was like, okay, so there's this whole avant-garde thing, or like this free jazz thing, and we're gonna get, who's another big free jazz guy? So we look up in the book, and there's Sun Ra. So like, okay, let's go and let's listen to Sun Ra. And of course, the one that everyone talks about or talked about in the book was Other Planes of the Air. And Other Planes of the Air is a big band record where no more than like 2 players play together at the same time on the whole record. And it's probably his most out record, Sun Ra's, 1965, something like that. Recorded lo-fi, everything. So we came home, bought it, put it on. We're just like laying on the floor. Stereo's really loud, and it sounded like noise. We didn't understand what was happening. Like you're like, okay, Sun Ra's got a big band, and then you hear like no more than 2 instruments playing together at the same time, often just solo, whatever. Like this is very hard to take, until we were just kind of sitting there one time, maybe the day after, 2 days later, whatever, just like, hey, let's try this again. And it kind of clicked. And it was like, okay, imagine yourself in space, and these instruments, these personalities are planets or objects sort of coming to you, and you're encountering them, and then they're going away, and another one is coming, and then different groupings, and then, but like all very kind of ephemeral. And then they kind of disappear as kind of just as they arrived. I was like, okay, now I get it. Now this makes sense to me, or like aesthetically, it kind of makes sense to me. So that was that's when I figured out that like sometimes you need strategies to understand this stuff, and that a small tweak in perception will completely open a door. So I was like, okay, now I know that that's the case. I can prepare myself mentally, or like prepare my ears to process new things that don't seem to make sense to me on first hearing.
Yeah, I think I've had a pretty similar experience with different records that I've tried to get into. I found sometimes something as simple as a repeated listen, and even having it in the background, you can subconsciously take in something that previously would have been you would have been unaware of. Like, for example, Coltrane's Crescent record, which is probably not the most avant-garde or the most out there record, but I think it's still in the sort of less accessible side of broader music. And so I found just listening to it a couple of times, initially, you're kind of just puzzled. It's not like you don't like it, but you just you don't understand what you heard, right? Because it's just the language of the music is not familiar to you. And so you don't have the tools to really process what you're hearing. And it's almost like if you're ever in an environment where, I guess, you go to a different country and you spend enough time there, you'll start to pick up different words just because of, you can see what people are doing when they say those things. And so I think in the same way, sometimes listening to music that you don't understand over time and repeated listens, I think little bits can start to reveal themselves to you until you can piece together a bigger picture, which is in itself, I think, it's a really interesting experience.
It's wonderful. I mean, it's amazing. Like when something clicks, it's an amazing thing, and you sort of realize that. I mean, do you have kind of strategies that you use? I mean, you said like, repeated listening sort of in the background. At least, I guess what that does is that kind of dissipates the feeling of unusualness, right?
Yeah, I think whenever you hear a record for the first time, it's very overwhelming, because especially a more avant-garde or inaccessible piece, I think there's just so much coming at you that if you listen to it a dozen times or so over and over again, then there will be parts that are repeating. Some parts will have structure, and then I think those will kind of cement themselves, and then you can focus on the other parts, for example.
Right.
Perhaps cheating. It's in the internet era, there's also a lot of great resources. I mean, when I was trying to get into Igor Stravinsky, I was listening to The Rite of Spring, which is, I mean, certainly a weird piece of music, and it made no sense when I just listened to the recording of it. But then I read, the history of the piece and what it's actually about in the context. I think just understanding why the piece was written can provide you a lot of useful information about processing the way the music works.
Yes. And I don't know. I mean, it's so rewarding when you do it, and when you undertake that bit of effort. Something like that I've been thinking about a lot as I'm writing this piece on art and aesthetics and stuff like that for the American Mind right now is sort of that process, and the fact that that's kind of disappeared, even as we, as you said, like there's so many resources that are now available to you if you want to undertake this thing. At the end of the day, it's not even a matter of, it's not a matter of money. It's not a matter of time. It's not a matter of, any kind of special knowledge. at the end of the day, it's kind of an inclination, right? Like you
It's an
want to be
intellectual
able.
curiosity, I think, as well, right?
Yes, yes,
Mhm.
yes. And you're not going like that. I'm not sure if that intellectual curiosity is transferable.
Mhm.
Like that's the thing that I've got to think about.
Mhm. Well,
Because there are people who are hungry for it, who crave it, and then there are people who just like will not, like they don't understand. They have no desire.
well, I wanted to ask you that as well. Why is it you think that some people they have this curiosity where they hear what music that they grew up with or whatever is popular and they like at the moment, but then they think to venture on and find new things and more difficult things to listen to, and some people just don't have any interest in that at all. Is there a specific way you can get someone to do this, or is it sort of an innate predisposition?
It's a difficult one because I mean, as I said, I've been thinking about this a lot, and where I've kind of come down is that the society has conspired to make it. Society has conspired to create art and culture. Let's just say culture, culture that surrounds us, that frankly is not, that is disposable, that is not intended for serious listening or viewing or reading or whatever. Um, the point of it is not to, I mean, the point of dance music is not to listen to beautiful harmonies and melodies. The point of dance music is a continuous, predictable rhythmic pulse that allows you to go to a dance club and kind of do that physical thing. Um, and I think everything is kind of like that. There was a time back, not even that long ago, when there was art and culture of quality that kind of, it almost demanded for you to take it seriously and to bring something to it. Um, there's a difference, I think, between, yeah, I mean, just go back a couple generations, right? Go back to like our parents' generation, et cetera. You'd be into the Beatles, and then from there you would also jump into things that were also like more abstract, which today would be crazy, you know. Like for example, I mean, Led Zeppelin. You know, Led Zeppelin. Yes, in the scheme of things, is it simple? Yes, it's simple. But you compare Led Zeppelin to what is on the radio today and what a lot of people are listening to today, and it's unbelievably complex and intricate. Um, or Pink Floyd or things like that,
Yeah.
things that sort of demanded attention, but also time. And there is a big difference, technologically between putting on a record that's 23, 24 minutes long and like you're listening to one side. And even if you're not 100% focused on it, you're listening to one side. You're more than likely not just moving it, every 30 seconds or every 5 seconds to the next track the way we can do when we have the unlimited musical archive that is streaming. So it's an attention span thing too, I think. It's just a whole bunch of things that conspired to make us less likely to be kind of investigatory and to want to do the work, because doing the work it's not hard, but it's like it's also work, right? Like it's something, it's effort of some kind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I'm glad you brought up the last point about vinyl, and I know you're a vinyl guy and you grew up with a stereo at home when you were younger. Do you think that the way that we've, in the last 15, 20 years, we've grown up to the way we're maybe conditioned to see music, I think, is a more, it's kind of disappeared from the focal point of the living room in some senses. I think the traditional stereo system and the speakers have kind of been relegated to at most a sound bar, I think, and maybe 90% of homes. And so the way the whole activity, yeah, of music, I think, has more so just been changed from being a thing that you sit down on the couch and you properly listen to being something in the car, something in your headphones at the gym. Is so I think maybe the way that music is perceived as the way it should be consumed, I think that perhaps has had some impact as well on the kind of music that we're conditioned to expect and to listen to.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I have to say, I've got a wonderful stereo at home to the point where, like, I mean, I have the stereo of my life. I'm not going to make any change. I have no desire to make any changes to it, which is a really new and amazing place to be. For someone who spent so many years kind of chasing gear. But that said, like, there are days when I'm just like, I don't feel like putting on a record, and I'm sitting here with like thousands of records. And it's much easier just to go and put on a podcast or sit around as I'm eating lunch and even listen to something on the phone. Even though I've got an amazing stereo just like a few paces down the road. So like it affects me too, of course. Yeah. So if it affects me, then like, I mean, what hope what hope does the casual listener have? That said, I mean, I work from home, you work from home. It's a lot easier, not only to rationalize spending decent money on a on a stereo, but also like, you're home. So even if you're not right in front of, even if you're not at the stereo to, where you're working, you could take a break and, you make lunch for yourself and you go and listen to, one or two sides of a record and you're good. And it's a kind of nice little break. I mean, I can't listen to vinyl when I'm working. There is no way, because I get wrapped up in things and I will destroy that stylus. I will not flip it over. It'll just keep going and going and going. I actually looked into an automatic, which they had when I was a kid. It's like the record ended and it would pick up, the tone arm and go all the way back. And unfortunately, there's no hi-fi.
Yeah, no,
option.
I think those are kind of looked down upon in the audiophile world,
which is silly. Like, it's actually silly. Like, I don't know why they don't make a mechanism like that that will do it. I mean, do they demand that you're sitting there full time in like the leather chair at all times listening to
I think the utmost purists would say it somehow degrades the sound quality having these extraneous mechanisms in, and they're like, you just have the bare bones. You got your cueing lever and the arm, and that's basically
Yeah, I would be very happy to trade in that little minuscule amount of audio quality for the ability to not fuck up my records.
Yeah.
But I mean, as it stands right now, like it's fine. But in my office, I do streaming or digital of some kind, and it's fine because I can not even think about it if I put on Tidal and I listen to a record, and then it starts to play whatever mix it puts together for me. And like, honestly, after a while of intensive work, I don't even notice. Sometimes I work in silence just because the album ended and I'm just completely focused.
Well, I think what I've kind of come to believe over maybe the last couple of years is, as great as vinyl is, I think for a lot of people who just want to get into appreciating music more and enjoying the music that they like, something as simple as just a two-speaker, a stereo system with no extraneous record players or vinyl is enough to get started. I think even with the Tidal or streaming these days, as long as you're streaming to decent speakers, or they can reproduce their music to some degree, it's already miles above listening to the built-in speakers in a TV or your soundbar. And I think just a small improvement like that, I think, will give you a whole different appreciation for the music.
Right. No, I mean, I think that's completely true. I know when I am asked all the time, and I'm sure you're asked all the time too, it's like, hey, can you advise me on what kind of vinyl set or what kind of stereo to buy? It's always together with the vinyl, right?
Mhm.
So like I understand that people feel like, okay, I want to buy a vinyl thing. But maybe you're right in what you just said, that it makes more sense to say, you know what, we're going to pause the vinyl for a little while, and we're just going to do a nice setup where you can stream. But probably if you're advising someone on an amp or a preamp or some kind of combo unit, you may want to just make sure that there's a phono stage in there, or
Mhm.
just make sure that things will be compatible later on if someone decides to do that. But it's true. I feel bad when people ask, right? Because I want to be honest with them. I want to tell them how much money is involved.
Yeah.
And they think that it's like, oh, okay, it's just like you go in off the shelf and you just get something and it's decent. And I want to, I mean, the important point that I always make is it's going to take you a lot more money
Mm-hmm.
to get yourself a vinyl setup that even approaches the sound that you're expecting from digital.
Yeah, that was a similar journey that I had in my audiophile rabbit hole. It's been more than a decade at this point, but I really had it in me that I wanted to get a record player, and I kind of like the aesthetic of vinyl.
Right.
But I didn't have I hadn't really at this point. I had some computer speakers that I was listening to music on, and so I was even told by a friend of mine who was kind of an audiophile, like, you should just get speakers, that's what's going to make a difference. And I was like, no, I need a turntable. And so I found something, I used one on the internet, and I brought it home. It was something like $200 at the time, and I bought a record. I put it on, and I plugged it into computer speakers, and I was like, oh, this is cool. I guess this black thing is spinning and music is coming up, but I wasn't.
But it sounds like crap.
Yeah, I had this expectation, like, oh, it's vinyl. I'm gonna, the band is gonna appear in front of me, and it's gonna be this this transcendent experience, and it was not that at all. And it was only after that I went and I bought an amplifier, and I bought proper passive speakers, that I was like, I noticed it sounded remarkably better. And then I ended up plugging a CD player out of curiosity into the same stereo, and I was like, well, this also sounds much better than what I was used to. And yeah, I think you see these like statistics, like there's a vinyl resurgence and people are buying records, but then you go and see most of these people's the way they listen to records, and it's like a Walmart Audio Technica record player with a ceramic cartridge plugged into a soundbar, and they're like listening to The Dark Side of the Moon or Fleetwood Mac on it. And so a lot of people are buying into the aesthetic of vinyl, which is cool.
And it's no surprise, that people don't become vinyl fanatics after that.
Mm-hmm.
And then they'll go and they'll say like, oh, okay, here's the new, I just saw my friend said, like, the 50th anniversary of Harvest, new pressing coming out. Like, okay, what? I'm going to drop $40-$50 on a record, and I'm going to be playing it through my soundbar on a shitty Walmart table. Like that, none of that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
None of that makes sense. And it's like, it's almost like a conspiracy to make people walk away from it.
Yeah, I think most of these people, they'll buy a couple of like classic rock records. They'll put up pictures on Instagram, and that's pretty much it. And then 95% of the music they listen to will still be just on Spotify and streaming it or something. And so it doesn't really progress beyond that initial point, because I think most people don't really realize the potential or the capabilities of actually listening to music on a proper stereo system.
Right. Well, I mean, I think that it was always the case that people liked, or that it was always the case that people had shitty setups. That most people had shitty setups at the end of the day. But now the digital thing, I mean, since the CD era, the digital thing is so good. The quality is so good. You know, none of the artifacts of vinyl, none of the skipping, none of the delicate, you know, the delicacy with which you've got to like physically handle the thing. You know, when CDs came out, you didn't have to worry about wearing out a record. It used to be people bought like 4 copies of the same record that they listened to over and over because they would wear out the grooves. But you know, now as people have, you know, real digital things that sound decent to compare it to, then you know it's that additional hurdle that I think is kind of difficult to overcome.
And I was curious before, you know, we can get into Brazilian music a little bit. Did you ever have a phase of getting into classical music? Because I know we talked a little bit about that as well, and you were, you know, I think familiar with some different recordings and orchestras now. So I was wondering if there was ever a phase of that that went by.
I did. So when I was in 8th grade, I realized that, you know, I was kind of seized with the idea that I should know about classical music because, you know, I want to be a cultured adult.
Yeah.
And it just so happened that at the record stores at that time, they had budget classical. And I don't know what the market is, but some were good, some were bad, you know, et cetera. I you know, sort of based on the packaging, if it looked not cheesy, and it was like, you know, if it wasn't like, you know, blah blah blah, the orchestra of, you know, bumfuck and you know, whatever. Like, okay, at the time it was $4.95 for a CD in that budget section. And I think it was a Soviet. This was one particular label, and I really liked the aesthetics of the covers. I thought they were all interesting. They had a bunch of them, and it was like Soviet or Eastern Bloc orchestras. And for $4.99, you know, I mean, I was a kid. I didn't have that much money, but I had $4.99. You know, regularly to spend on CDs. So I would go to the store and I would see like, oh, you know, this is a Brahms thing. I've heard of Brahms, Beethoven. I've heard of it, and I would just buy them up like candy and listen to them. Sort of mentally filing away, like, okay, you know, I like the Russians.
Yeah.
Germans, it's, you know, it's a little bit of a mix, but I really like the French. Blah 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 blah. Okay, and then I would see, so, you know, whatever. I was, you know, I mean, I was interested in piano music, but really for some reason I always gravitated towards chamber music. I loved string quartets and string trios, quintets. Things like just all chamber music is wonderful. And then I heard, I think through Woody Allen, I was like, oh, he talks about Mahler in more than one film. I'm gonna see what Mahler is about. And then I heard the Fifth Symphony, and the first recording of that I had was the Bernstein. Which ends up probably as the one. No. It's. I don't think it's the definitive one. I think the definitive one is Pierre Boulez.
Okay.
Of that particular one, and then I heard the Fifth Symphony, and I was like, oh my god, holy shit, this is something. And I mean, prior to that, I had gone through Beethoven. I had gone through, I mean, I heard every Beethoven symphony. I heard many of the concertos and blah blah blah. And to me at the time, Bach sounded like, you hear one piece, you've heard it all. I always had a problem with cantatas. It took me a long time to understand the cantatas, just the choral thing.
Yeah.
But that's where chamber music was sort of where my inclination has always been, because I don't know why, I've always hated big, bombastic, like heavy,
but you like Mahler,
theatrical things. Yeah, but what was it in the Fifth Symphony that really got me was the melody of the Adagietto.
Okay.
I was like, this is the most beautiful music I've ever heard in my life. And then from there, the other huge thing that was like mind-blowing that you still, I mean, it's still one of the most beautiful and perfect pieces of music for me is the Ravel G minor concerto. And the Adagio. And I look, I mean, I'm a romantic. It's always the slow movement for me that is
the second movement, right?
Yeah. But in general, it's always the slow movements for me that I instantly like. Where do I want to go when I get the record or whatever? I want to hear. That's what I want to hear first. Because if it's not beautiful, then I'm probably not going to spend time with it. So it's always been a sort of chamber music versus orchestral music thing. I got into art songs while I was in college. Schubert and Samuel Barber, and some of the French composers. I had a professor who studied with Nadia Boulanger, and through him, I got hip to a whole bunch of stuff as well. Milhaud and Poulenc, and some of the Lacis guys. And of course, like Ravel is still to me, just very important. And it's funny because the classical people end up not liking Ravel, but the jazz people end up really liking Ravel. And I think
Ravel had a lot of jazz influences, right? And even in his the one you mentioned, the G minor piano concerto, the first movement of that is that there's just so much jazz. So much you can hear through the entire piece, and then the slow movement is a bit more of a romantic classical style, and then it ends. The third movement again is very jazzy.
Yeah, and of course Debussy, his I mean, the piece that probably the most influential piece of classical music on jazz that nobody's ever heard is the Debussy piece for, like, what is it, for clarinet, viola, and flute? I have to check. I'm sorry about this, but it ended up influencing an entire generation of players, most notably Jimmy Giuffre, who created his famous trio of clarinet, bass, and guitar. And sort of every piano-less, drum-less configuration in the 1950s and 60s owes a debt to this piece.
An interesting thing that I kind of discussed often with a friend of mine. He's a classic rock guy as well, but he's a classical pianist. And something that's kind of come up I wanted to ask you about as well is just comparing the calibers of musicians in, say, the classical world to the classical rock world over largely the 20th century. You had these touring pianists in the Soviet Union, the United States, guys like Vladimir Horowitz and Richter. These different pianists with their interpretations of Rachmaninoff and Chopin and Liszt and whatnot. And I think one point that I just found as an interesting point of discussion here was that in the world of classical music, in the world of touring concert pianists, predominantly the repertoire you're playing is you're playing your interpretation of Chopin or your interpretation of Beethoven or whatever piece you're playing, but the musicality and the creativeness involved in your interpretation of an existing work, compared with someone who is considered one of the great kind of classic rock people, like let's say a Jimi Hendrix or I don't know, it's like a Keith Richards, right? If someone where perhaps the music in broad sense is original that they write it, but it is based on, I guess, fairly known blues standards and blues keys and whatnot. And so, where do you see the greater merit, perhaps? I don't think there's really a correct necessarily answer here, but I think just as something to discuss.
Yeah, I mean, greater merit is a kind of difficult one, you know, that I don't even really.
I don't think that's maybe the best way to phrase it, but it just.
Yeah, I mean, I could just say like what appeals to me more.
Yeah.
But these two things are very different. You know, I mean, they're different aside from aesthetically, right? I mean, anyone can tell on the surface aesthetically that these things are very different, but they're different in another way, in the sense that if you're listening to a Horowitz piece or a piece performed by Vladimir Horowitz or Richter or or Gould or I mean, just kind of name who you want. Number one is you're probably familiar with the piece, or at least you're familiar with other interpretations of it, so you can understand what is happening, even if it's not particularly to your taste. You say, okay, I like what he's doing with the third movement there. Like he's really swinging in that part, or like, I don't know, the allegro was rushed in this particular version, and blah blah blah. I preferred a little, a little bit slower. Blah 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 blah. It requires a familiarity with. You have to have had some kind of education. You have to have, and that education doesn't necessarily mean musical education in terms of performance or theory. But it has to do with experience, right? Like you need the experience having heard in order to draw that conclusion, in order to really understand what makes, I mean, in order to truly understand what makes Glenn Gould special, you've got to hear the way they were performing Bach prior to Gould. And then once you hear Gould playing, once you hear him playing Schoenberg, you're like, oh my God, now it totally makes sense what he's doing with Bach.
Yep.
Or what he's doing with Beethoven.
Yeah.
Probably even more radical. So it's like, it just requires more background. It requires more background. Whereas like, whatever, Jimi Hendrix or the Rolling Stones or whatever, like this is the piece. This is the piece. It does not require an entire kind of musical education in order to sort of understand.
And I think just further on that, I find interesting that in the classical world, the interpretations, I mean, they are pretty much endless. I mean, the Horowitz passed away, I think, in the 90s or so, and Gould and so on. But even the last 20 years, I mean, we have really wonderful and very famous classical pianists today. There's like with Kissin or Trifonov who are touring, and people are listening to their new interpretation. I think they'll keep coming for centuries on. And with contrast to, I guess, like Jimi Hendrix, it seems like that contemporary music proficiency seems to have kind of died down. I mean, if you look at sort of popular music today versus then, it seems like the caliber of musicality, I think, has really been lost.
Yes, I think we have systematically deprioritized music that sort of comes with it, or let's say culture, because it's more than just music, but culture and art that brings a canon with it.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe the closest analog would be, I mean, and it's totally blasphemous to say it, but like the Marvel or DC cinematic universe, right? Where like, you see Daredevil and it's like, I know the Daredevil backstory, blah, 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 blah. I know his motivations. I know his da-da-da. Here is the new movie with Daredevil, and he's a part of that saga.
Mm-hmm.
And in the same way that, for example, samba or jazz or classical music has a repertoire. There are standards. There is the repertoire that like people are expected to know. Obviously players are expected to know, but the idea of a canon is a kind of beautiful thing, and a kind of storehouse of tradition. And when you see someone, this is another wonderful thing about Brazil, is you will go and you will see Brazilian pop stars like that make like trashy pop music. It's not trashy compared to American pop music. It's not like Lizzo.
Yeah.
It's far, far more elevated and musically interesting than that. But like you'll see these people and you'll see them routinely, all the time, routinely make it a point of they all want to do duets or collaborations with the great masters. They all want to do that. They see it as inherently legitimizing for them, and also it's something that they obviously want to do. And then you also see them playing or singing old songs. Sometimes from the 40s, from the 50s, from the 70s, whatever, like famous, famous tunes in the Brazilian popular music tradition or the samba tradition. And that's something that you don't see in American music. It's not something that you see in British music, or let's say the music of the English-speaking peoples. You just don't see it. Occasionally you'll see like, what a collaboration between so-and-so and Elton John or whatever it is, but it's not in any way the same as the way you see Brazilians do it. And I think that that's a beautiful thing. And that's a whole other conversation actually about how and why there is a very, very strong patriotic element in Brazilian music that is non-existent in the English-speaking world.
Okay, maybe we'll have to do that one next time.
Maybe we'll do another time. Yeah. Because that's something that I noticed. Like, how do you not notice that every third song, every third Brazilian song has to do with how wonderful and beautiful Brazil is?
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything like that in English? You can name a handful of things like, New York is a hell of a town, like, stuff from Manhattan, stuff from the kind of Tin Pan Alley or Great American Songbook era, just stuff made for plays. It's like, okay, the play is set in blah, blah, blah. Okay, that's fine. But we're not talking about like, hey, I'm going to write hundreds and hundreds of tunes about how wonderful, you know, my home state is. You know, you have that to a certain extent, but nothing on the level of Brazil. And that's,
Well, if
I
anything,
think,
in Western or in American music, if anything, you can make the case from at least the classic rock era. It was very much the opposite, where the famous and sort of the more enshrined classic songs are more in a sardonic tone. You know, they're more, you
right.
know, a protest
Well,
format.
they
Like
had that. They had
US.
that too. They had that too, but it exists together with like, you know, oh Bahia, you know, how beautiful you are, or
Yeah.
or just like, I mean, it's in everything. Love songs will have a you know, a throwaway verse talking about the beauty of Brazil.
Yeah,
And,
I think
you know,
if I had to think, I can't really come up with an objectively good kind of Western song about America that in a positive light. I mean, they're more kind of like these gimmicky, "God Bless the USA" kind of tunes,
right.
but you know, you would never really listen to in any serious format, or like Kid Rock, or you know, I don't know what kind of which is an interesting point as far as, you know, patriotic music goes. Why, you know, it's all very sort of simplistic, and you know, perhaps there could be a discussion on how, you know, when you approach to write music from a specific political angle, if that often can perhaps, you know, set the artistic side to be a more backseat element. But
Well, there's an answer to the question, right?
okay.
Like there's an answer to the question, which is twofold. Number one is because Brazil is a real country. You know, it's a melting pot, but it's not like a propositional melting pot like the United States.
Mm.
It's you know, I mean, they have many problems. They've always had many problems, black and white, etc. But like Brazil is the fusion of these two things. And everyone kind of knows that, everyone understands that, and it's kind of very easy to like once that the identity of Brazil is not in question in the way the identity of the United States is in question. That's number one. Number two is actually it was a government sponsored project to create samba tunes celebrating the beauty of Brazil in the 1930s. And I think this kind of created, I mean, it created the first things, because the government was like, hey, you know, we've got this carnival thing, and we've got, you know, these samba schools that are starting up, and these guys are doing, you know, it was an attempt to keep the people, and frankly the you know, the black people in Brazil away from candomblé,
Yeah.
you know, away from you know, the kind of the black magic African religious thing, to keep them closer tied to Catholicism, and then sort of keep them from being keep them from radicalizing. It's like, okay, let's make sure to create a kind of Brazil thing, and a stronger identity. There was a kind of government policy, and we never had that.
Yeah.
But I think it translated years later into like, hey, we actually kind of love our country, and we love singing about it, which is a kind of nice thing.
Yeah. Well, I think on that note, we can come to a close. So, since I know you're so passionate about Brazilian music, I was wondering, I know you've written about this actually yourself in Late Republic Nonsense yourself, but you can perhaps leave listeners with a very brief recommendation. People who have very little knowledge or understanding of Brazilian music, whether it's samba or bossa nova, of maybe a small handful of records or places to start, how to get into it.
Oh boy. Look,
I know I jumped a big.
Yeah, putting me on the spot. The answer is, when I knew very little about it, it was very easy, right? It was just, I would be, you know, like, okay, you know, here are these 4 records, blah blah blah. But the more you know about it, the more that, you know, experience that you have, it's literally a kaleidoscope, and it's very difficult to begin. And when people ask where to begin, I always say, okay, what do you like? Because there's Brazilian music that is adjacent to basically everything that someone likes.
I see.
So like, oh, they like, 80s pop music. Well, there's plenty of, I give them Jaban to
Yeah.
listen to. Or, if they're jazz people, then there's the whole bossa nova trip to get into. Or, there's soul music, everybody from, Georgia Bain to Wilson Simonal to, there's just many, DeMelo, there's many, many different strands. So, that's a really difficult one, and it depends on what you like. But I would say the thing is, just follow me on Twitter, and you'll see, you'll see my recommendations there.